certainly use your mute button. If there's no noise there, it just makes it easier, and we don't have to remind each other, famous line, you're muted, so and so. So you manage that part. The chat is open. Please do that. And Kellen, it is such an honor to get to know you more now as with our phone conversations, and then to have you come to work with us. Kellen is the lead organizer for ruralorganizing.com. And we're going to learn a lot about that and about Ohio voters that live in rural areas and how we can make a difference, how we can connect and make a positive difference for those of us living in urban and suburban and exurban and rural and all that. Kellen, I'll start out and then we'll open this up for sharing. Kellen, what is ruralorganizing.com and how does that how did you get involved? How did you build your enthusiasm into this?
Sure. Well, so for anyone who's going to search it, it's actually ruralorganizing.org.
Oh,
so not commercial, but ruralorganizing.org. And we get asked a lot. The .org is in the name, so don't just stop at rural organizing.
Does it switch over if I did .com? Like, I'm old and confused.
I don't know.
Switch over?
Maybe it's our evil twin. I'm not sure. I've never checked, okay. But y'all can.
Right.
So yeah, I think that the basics of ruralorganizing.org is that we are a 501c4. We are based out of Columbus, which is where I currently live, although I got my start doing organizing in Newark, Ohio, when I was in college at Denison University. And ruralorganizing.org, basically, if I had to boil it down to a sentence, our mission is to connect rural voters or rural communities to the progressive movement and the progressive movement to rural communities. There's conventional wisdom that says that is a impossible match. Resist that pretty vehemently. And then, if I got my start, I'm originally from Nashville, Tennessee, but I was drawn to rural work really when I got plugged into organizing that was empowering people in recovery and in reentry from jail and prison in Licking County. I'm from a big city and was very passionate about gentrification. I wanted to go to school to learn how to resist gentrification, and my mission was to come back to Nashville. But rural work really grabbed me, and I think it has something to do with the community bonds that are formed in small towns. And I liked participating in a very tightly knit community. And so, yeah, that's the nutshell of me and of the organization. If it's helpful, I can tell you a little bit about what we did in 2020, which might give you a better snapshot of what ruralorganizing.org gets up to. Yeah. So basically, my job is to handle the field work that our organization does. And we always aim for two birds with one stone in all of our field campaigns. And we were active predominantly in Kansas, North Carolina, and Iowa this past year. And we organize against far-right white supremacist candidates, but do it in a way where we test and innovate rural-specific organizing tactics and strategy. Because a lot of the organizing tactics that are in the progressive war chest are really pretty metrocentric. And so we understand, all of us, who might be in small towns calling in, know that what works in Columbus or Cincinnati is not going to necessarily work in Defiance or Ashtabula. And so that's the aim of our field work. And then we also do a lot of rural specific communication stuff. We've incubated a few rural progressive influencers and content campaigns, basically trying to figure out, new combinations of messengers and messages for the progressive movement, but then also messengers and messages for the rural agenda. again, as we try and build a bridge between those two worlds. And then we do national policy advocacy. Right now, so much of that is centered on making sure that rural communities are not left out of COVID stimulus efforts, and it has been a lot of that this past year. And making sure that those resources don't have a whole lot of strings attached that prevent it from reaching the rural communities that are the most vulnerable. Yeah, so that's a nutshell.
Great.
And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, let's open this up. We like a conversational style.
Cool.
And so to ask a question or a comment with Kellen, who would be first? Yes, Debbie.
What is the economic message that resonates in rural communities?
Yeah, the economic message. So that's a really good one. And I think that there's a whole lot of layers of that. A lot of how I got started in ruralorganizing.org began with an Ohio landscape survey where I interviewed a whole bunch of community leaders all across the state to ask what issues were most important. And the number one issue that came up was jobs. And job creation is not something that we can afford to back down from, especially in this state and in others that are rural battlegrounds as communities close up shop. I think that it's also really important that progressives don't forget, or maybe even might be the right way to phrase it, but pay attention to the condition in rural communities that this generation, the people who are living in rural places now, are the ones that are having to close the doors on the family small business or the family farm, or are seeing, these independent cornerstones of their local economy, at least ones that keep local money in local households, getting closed up shop. And the ways that that's not just it's not just, economically extractive, but it's culturally traumatizing. And I think that empathy and understanding of that dynamic is really important. So, job creation at all costs is not the message that we need to be falling into, but it's job creation that isn't extractive and that restores some of the fabric and vibrance of rural communities, and that helps. I think a message of self-reliance is actually very effective. So,
wow, good going.
I want to, if I can share a really brief anecdote. My friend Gary Gooseman, who was the director of the Free Store Food Bank, or he was the director of development, went to Athens to work for some economic development organization, and he became the mayor of Amesville, which is 150 people somewhere on the way to West Virginia. I've forgotten exactly. Right. But you know what he did, which I thought was incredibly clever? He bought a decommissioned school building and he made it into makerspace. And it's, stupidly cheap to lease a classroom, $50 a month or something, so that people could create, crafts and do things, make soap or quilt or do whatever. He actually went to the White House and spoke to Barack Obama about his experience doing that. And that's what I think about in terms of, bootstrapping communities, is that, somebody comes in and says, wow, what do we need here? Well, some maker space. And he did that.
Yeah, he did it. What's your thoughts about that, Kellen?
Yeah, I think that it's, that speaks to something else that is important to keep in mind about, effective rural economic messages, is that innovation isn't a big city, exclusive trait. And, projects like that emphasize and bring out, creative ideas and new combinations of collaborations within a community are really important. One of my favorite stories, or just favorite people that I met this year, was the Kansas Teacher of the Year, whose name is Tabitha Rossbroy. And she was an elementary school teacher who connected a senior living home with her elementary school class.
Yeah.
And had the whole town, or had the whole senior living groups or residents who were, I guess maybe not all of them, but all that were willing, served as the classroom aides. So you have a school that's under-resourced and seniors that are looking for constructive things to do. And so, I think that those sorts of collaborations are essential and partly why I stay in this work.
Yeah, fascinating. Antoinette.
Yes, thanks for being here, Kellen. I heard you, I don't know, a month or so ago at a National Indivisible call, and was excited to hear that you're based in Columbus now. One question, I guess the question that I have has like a two-pronged approach. The first part is that last week I attended another Indivisible national rural call, and it was two women from Illinois who live in rural Illinois as opposed to Chicago. Yep. And they were talking about a statewide organization called Indivisible Illinois Social Justice Alliance, which is working to bring broadband to the Illinois rural communities. And so my question is ruralorganizing.org that type of organization for Ohio, or is there an equivalent organization for Ohio? And second part of that is, what is the broadband situation for our rural communities in Ohio?
Yeah, so the first part, I guess, part one of that question is very easy. It's that we are not the statewide Ohio organization that is a rural center of gravity. We need one. I'm glad that Illinois has one. But yeah, we are not that. Someone should step into that role and we would totally support it. And, would love to share all the, amazing people who we've met along the way who would plug into something like that. But so part one of that is easy. Part two of that actually is much harder. I was really amazed. I was involved with my own sort of broadband work in Perry County, Ohio. As part of the Perry County think tank on poverty. I moonlight as a volunteer community organizer still. Just through talking with activists from across the state who we met, the different the different challenges that arise with broadband in communities, I've been surprised at how diverse they are. Whether that's just like divestment or its geographical challenges of hilly mountainous topography in the southeast. So I think that I'm not prepared to talk about the way, like the different solutions that are needed for community broadband. But one organization that I actually would champion all the way, who's helpful, and I think really Ohio could use because there's such a diversity of broadband struggles, is and of course I'm going to blank on it right when I need it. Oh yeah, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. They help local organizations and local municipalities tailor community-owned and anti-extraction solutions to broadband. And a variety of other things. I couldn't name them all. But, I think that Ohio isn't a state that's ripe for a blanket solution, at least from what I understand, because it's got a diverse set of challenges. But I think that we do need mentorship as a state from organizations like that are good at coming up with those very local problems and are focused on community-owned solutions. So for further reading, totally check them out. But that's the end of my expertise on it.
Yeah, good. Who's next? You're welcome to put your, there's, Antoinette did this in the reactions, I believe, for most people. There is a little yellow hand up, but we're a pretty easy to work with together work group of 19. So you can almost just put your hand up or just speak up as long as we don't on top of each other. And I'm so glad Ed is modeling that. Ed, please share.
Yes, Kellen, you opened your brief talk with giving an overview of what ruralorganizing.org does. And you put it in two categories: the field organizing itself in rural communities, and how that's different than in urban, and then the messaging is the other piece. And so I guess, and I actually have a whole list of questions, but
Sure.
I guess this one that we're kind of talking about is if you're not doing any kind of statewide project like in Illinois, what are the projects that you're working on, let's say between now and 2022, perhaps here in Ohio, since we've got this important, some important elections in 2022. I had the impression that rural organizing, by the way, in my work, I'm very much involved with the local county party, but I follow very closely what ruralorganizing.org does, because you've got a lot of resources, you do research, you provide the messaging has been real helpful for our work.
I'm glad.
But at any rate, that's a side point. What's your plan for Ohio in the next year and a half?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I'm glad you asked it. And I would say if you've been tracking ruralorganizing.org for the past couple years of our existence, which really is just since 2019, so literally a couple, the work that we've done has been not disjointed, but in different directions, I would say, focused both on sort of national advocacy work, and then really trying to resource local civic leaders, which I would include county party leaders as civic leaders, the same way that I would include progressive pastors, sort of a broad catch-all category of the people who we hope find our research useful. But this coming year, we have been working we have been working on creating rural progressive landscape assessments in several 2022 battleground states that have very heavy rural voter populations. And the purpose of that is to identify momentum and important groups that are worth resourcing, and also to identify stakeholders who are, interested in building the sort of rural center of gravity that, it sounds like Illinois might be enjoying. The rural progressives do need a center of gravity, and we need collaboration across geography. And the nature of rural organizing does make that hard, especially when there's resources that only enter rural communities for organizing very last minute in election years. And so I see some big thumbs up. Yeah. If you're a local rural candidate, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Exactly. Right. And so, while I wouldn't claim any of the states that we are, analyzing as our turf by any means, but instead, understanding that, there hopefully is a role to play as a partner and convener in starting to build not just collaboration within a state, but collaboration across rural states, in the hopes that we can, solidify as a strong component of the progressive movement that's trying to make sure that we're using 20 resources available in 2021 through the stimulus for wins in our communities first. But then also using those wins to help restore faith in collective action and in the importance of good government, that will translate for wins for, progressives who delivered in 2022. So I think I hope that is not too winding. It's a very large project. We actually see it continuing all the way to 2024. Hoping that we are still going to be putting progressives and not white supremacist candidates in the White House. But all of this is based on a strategy that, in the winning recipe for progressives is running up the lead that we have in metro areas, but especially in a state like Ohio, for example, or an emerging battleground like Kansas. We need to also cut margins in rural communities. Back when Ohio turned blue on election night, there was strong representation and there were rural counties, that were showing up for Democrats. And we cannot give up on those. Our cities aren't big enough yet. And so if we want power now, we have to, improve on our margins, like I said.
The political analyst and writer Steve Phillips has written a book a few years ago, now updated, called Brown is the New White, and he's got a new book coming out fairly soon. His point, and he's very much an analyst, is that the new American majority are two groups: people of color and progressive whites. If you put those two groups together, and they vote, of course, if they don't vote, it doesn't make any difference, really. But as far as a electoral majority, those two groups, people of color and the progressive whites, are the majority. And does any of your data and all that's not excluding rural, because there's loads of people of color and progressive whites in rural. But how do you is he at all accurate, do you think? And what is from your research, Kellen, how would you respond to his claim for this?
Yeah, I mean, I am very much looking forward to the day when, the demographics, sort out to the point where there's just an indomitable majority of, progressive voting people of color and progressive voting white people.
Yeah.
And I, am very inspired by, the racial justice work that has been done this past year. And I think that slowly but surely, Democrats and progressives are, learning to follow the leadership of people of color, not just in racial justice issues, but in economic and gender justice issues as well. But I had I will answer with an anecdote, and it's that I talked to one of the statewide leaders in Kentucky this year, and on our side, who told me, we cared a lot and invested a lot in turning out members of the new American majority. In the state of Kentucky, the new American majority is not a majority yet. Yeah. And, we are realizing through all the voter suppression laws that are coming out as well, that there are a lot of fail-safes for the right. The Electoral College, the U.S. Senate, and the State House. And so if we want to make gains today and right now, and also stop the progress, the forward march that's been going on in state houses really for decades, we need to go after, we need to not just circle the wagons around metros where, we typically think of as the home base for the new American majority. So, I am not going to argue with the trends at all, that the new American majority is growing and will be a majority. But what keeps me up at night, is the systems that are in place in our system of government, that are designed and built to, prohibit the power of the new American majority, that aren't going to go away unless we fight like hell now.
Yeah, good point. Elaine.
Hi, Kellen. You said you were looking to collaborate with other rural groups in Ohio. Are you familiar with Buckeye State Rural?
Yes, I am. Yeah. Are you a member?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. I loved the yard signs, or not the yard, the billboards, driving past them. I wasn't leaving my house enough this fall, especially when I was doing 60-hour weeks on Zoom. And so I left, took a drive, Sunday drive to one of the yard signs, or I keep saying yard signs, one of the billboards.
That's the billboards.
Yeah, I appreciate y'all not surrendering our highways. Yeah.
Well, I am in an urban area, but I very much feel that, in order to save Ohio and the country, we have to go through the rural areas. So that's why I contribute.
Yeah. Why did you join, Elaine? Or what is it that you find valuable there? What is the name again? Buckeye
State Rural.
Okay, Buckeye State. Yeah.
And
What do you find valuable? What do you find valuable with that?
They put up billboards that address the issues that rural people have that Democrat Party is looking to solve, and they're in rural areas. So that's, think about this. Who are you really for? And of course, just like Helen said, it's the economic issues that they're dealing with, that they try to focus on, and the inequalities that we have in the rural places in Ohio. I have friends that came from those areas, southeastern Ohio, Pike County. And so I know some of the people there.
Yeah. Oh,
good. Leah Hackelman Good is like, I had the privilege of talking to her and checking in. I believe it was an October call. But actually there's a few, I believe that y'all are a super PAC. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so I'm very inspired by a couple of the grassroots super PACs that are starting to crop up, across Ohio. I know that there's one that's emerging in the Southwest. I don't believe they've named it yet. But just another, part of the state that is easily overlooked, especially by national campaign strategists. But a PAC in the hands of locals, is something that would really excite me. And I'm looking forward to watching y'all, and then hopefully others will spring up between now and 2022, because it's important work and it's good grassroots work too.
Yes, I wouldn't say it's a super PAC, but it is a PAC, and it is trying to organize the rural areas and, strengthen the rural areas. And like I said, I have friends from Pike County area, and that's how I got involved. But I hardly ever go out there to see the billboards, but they're great.
Yeah, thank you. With us is Ellen Green Bush. She is the American Promise Ohio key leader, which is eliminating the corruption of big dark money in elections and lawmaking. So thanks for your leadership so much, Ellen, with that organization, and others as well. I know that you do. Please, what is your question or comment?
Well, my question is about corruption. Our state house, as everybody knows, has been mired in corruption, and basically nothing has been done about it. And so what I was wondering is, how does the issue of corruption resonate with rural voters? Is it an important issue? Do people know about it? Do people care about it? Will it influence their voting? And one of the reasons I'm asking is, I know that Nan Whaley, who's running for governor, that is going to be an important part of her messaging, is bringing in new faces into our state government that have not been caught up in all the corruption.
Yeah. So I can say that the statement, we did a lot of polling. We did 3 rounds of polling last year through the spring and summer, figuring out which messages resonate with rural voters. And we must end the corruption in Washington, D.C. was the message that resonated the strongest with rural voters. And it is essential that we include that in our work. What we need to understand, though, is rural voters see that as a Republican message. And rural voters see that as a Republican campaign priority in a way that they don't see it, or at least don't believe it to be a genuine Democratic campaign priority. And so, like the work that is being done around that, especially on the progressive side, is crucial, absolutely crucial. And we need to, bring that issue and champion it all the way to, rural communities. So I can say definitively, yes, it resonates so much, but we have a lot of work to do to convince rural voters that we're the party that cares about that and that's going to deliver on it.
So let me try to understand what you're saying then. That message, we need to end corruption in Washington, it resonates with Republican voters.
With rural voters.
With rural voters.
Yeah.
Okay, rural voters. But not necessarily one party or the other. Is that correct?
Well, I would say it resonates with rural voters, but a strong majority of rural voters believe that is a Republican priority and not a Democrat priority.
Okay, that's what I was trying to understand. So then just following from that, then would that not be a good message then if you're trying to elect progressives or Democrats?
No, it's a really good message. It's a really good message. We have to explain what we mean by that, and we need to deliver on it. I would say that the main thing that is holding back the Democratic brand, if you will, with rural voters who we can win, and I'm not talking about the white supremacists who we can't win, but the ones who
Right.
we can win. We need to deliver for those voters, and it's a priority that Democrats all have to champion. And I don't think that Democrats are in lockstep with that being with making anti-corruption central to Democratic platforms from the bottom of the ticket up. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so then if you had a message that said, while the legislators in Columbus were lining their pockets with, millions and millions and millions of dollars as a result, your electric bill has gone up so much. I mean, do you have to connect it? Do you have to connect the message to how it hurts an individual voter in the rural area?
So I actually think that the weakness in that message is that rural voters are going to be like, yeah, they are. Exactly. That's like, I'm here. But those legislators are Democrats. like that's what's interesting.
Yeah, but they're not Democrats.
Yeah, but
they think
you don't need
are?
to convince me.
Okay, so when they think of corruption, they think of, if they're a Republican voter, they think of a Democrat.
No, if they're a rural voter, they think of a Democrat.
Okay, if they're a rural voter, they think the corrupt politicians are Democrats.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Okay,
actually,
well then.
Yeah. So you see the trickiness of it, and that's where I think that is a potential pitfall of nonpartisan language. Is that if you were to run Facebook ads on that and see how they performed, for example, right? Just saying, legislators in Columbus, in Ohio, legislators in Columbus are lining their pockets while your electric bill's going up, just for example, it would perform really well. But, making that partisan in a way that is going to impact a partisan election as opposed to something that is a nonpartisan vote, like an
issue or something.
Yeah, like a ballot initiative. That's what's tricky. And I think that it's something that progressive advocacy needs to So, and I don't have, I couldn't off the cuff give you the, the wisdom on what to change about that message, because that's a fairly new finding just for us in our own polling. And, we've been, it's something that we are continuing to research and are making a priority this year. And we're sort of thinking about what polling or research project will help to inform that. But
well, that's really interesting.
Yeah. And so if your organization would love to talk more about that as well, or maybe, we would want to get into something, I could definitely prepare a compilation of the research we've done, and we could have a, heart to heart about that, because they're hard questions to answer.
Yeah. Thank you.
When we spoke before, Kellen, too, you said you had some things you could throw up into the screen share.
Yes.
Anywhere along the line that you think we can, pictures are powerful, or data when it's analyzed and framed in a certain way are powerful. Anytime you want to do that, please just open the window and give us a tour.
So let me just show you all really quick what I'm looking at when I'm making some of these outlandish claims here. So this right here is a message matrix that came from ruralorganizing.org's June and July polling. And just to explain what we see here, can everyone see my arrow? Can I get like a thumbs up?
Yeah.
Okay. So the message column, these are messages that we came up with. These are not all the messages. This was like a giant poll. And I should say, just to qualify, this is a poll of 7,000 rural voters across about, I think it was 7 or 8 battleground states. So this is not like, these are just battlegrounds. These are not safe blue or safe red states, just so everyone knows, but 7,000 just rural voters. And what we did was we asked first, do you agree with the message or do you disagree with the message? And then we had the same list of answers, and we said, all right, so, regardless of whether you agree with it or not, who would say it, and whose campaign is going to talk about this? And so you could say, huge agreement, we must end the corporate corruption in Washington, D.C. 91% are, heck yeah. The majority of people think that that's Trump's priority, and so we've got some work to do there. I was happy to see, employers should be required to pay women and men the same wages for the same work. A lot of these should be 100s, right? In a perfect world. And that's very clear. It was people are like, yeah, that's a Biden message. Government policy should benefit working people and not the elite. Also, I think that the Biden campaign would be, happy that that was a clear distinction for them. This is interesting, though. Corporate lobbyists have too much influence over the government. 83% agree. And basically the reason that this is white is because the combination who said don't know who would say it, neither would say it, or both would say it, outweighed either Trump or Biden. So there's not good distinguishing there. Also, this is really important. The small town and rural way of life is worth fighting for. Again, really, really strong agreement. Unfortunately, if it was Biden or Trump, 36%, as opposed to 24% for Biden. But again, both, neither, or don't know is a bigger category of uncertainty than either one of the candidates. Patriotism, I don't think anyone would be surprised. Trump's rhetoric was pretty, extreme nationalist the whole way through. But patriotism really resonates in rural communities. And then here's another corruption question for you, Ellen. Lawmakers should be banned from ever becoming paid lobbyists. 78% agreement. Split 25 and 25. But there's lots of people who are, both or up for grabs, unsure. So and then corporate monopolies. Here's another corruption question. and there's still majority uncertainty. So I hope that breakdown is helpful to understand why I'm saying that there's some, we've got some, not discriminating to do. We have, what is the word I'm looking for? We have to distinguish ourselves stronger.
That last one too, Kellen, my faith is important to me, I think it read, and Trump outpolled, or Trump was more likely to say that than Biden, you know, who goes to church every week. And when does Trump go or claim any allegiance with?
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, actually, and let me just, I'll pull up one more.
Sure.
I think that there's a nuanced point to make here. We can't allow racism to divide and distract us from the real source of our problems. I think that the work that is being done around the race class narrative nationwide is really, really important. I think it's innovative. But we see here that, you know, I think it testifies to the precision with which the race class narrative needs to be used. This is a like race class narrative sloppy or adjacent statement. You know, people who are trained in that line of work would say that this is not, you know, this isn't what we're talking about. But we can see that if it's not used precisely and it's just sort of a vague, we can't allow racism to distract us, or we can't allow racists to distract us, people will be like, yeah, for sure. But, you know, these are people who would be like, yeah, but Black Lives Matter is racist.
Yeah.
Like, you will get super strong agreement on this statement, but people think that Trump is the one who's saying we can't allow racism to distract us.
Yeah.
Right. So
I can see it's a mixed message, isn't it?
It is.
It can be interpreted different ways.
Yeah. Yep. So
that's fascinating.
It is very fascinating. Yeah. And I think it speaks to also, you know, the work that rural organizers have to do, you know, to really hone and shape messaging and understand that it can't be something that, you know, any one group of small formation of people just sort of pulls out of their ear. But it takes a lot of deliberation and a lot of thought. So
yeah.
You know,
before you used the word I thought was clever, message and messenger, putting those two together is, you know, it sounds good. And it, but you were looking here at message. Describe your views about what does messenger mean for you, Kellen?
Yes. Okay. So that's good. And I've got another little,
please. Yeah.
Sharing a little
Your
bit.
pictures are good.
Yeah. So what I will say is the advice that we give for people who are in grassroots groups, all the way up to campaigns, even, you know, when they ask us, well, what messages resonate? You know, it helps to insert a little, be like, well, let's back up. We need to talk about what messengers resonate, because in rural communities, messengers are often more important than your message. So as part of the same body of research, we asked which messengers rural voters trusted. And so how trustworthy do you find the following people? Local doctors and nurses. 89% said that they were very trustworthy, you know, or trustworthy or very trustworthy. Next were farmers and ranchers, members of the U.S. military, local business women and men, then teachers and educators. Those 5 really local voices, you know, really stood out to us and is essential. You know, we can look way down here. You're members of Congress, members of the national media. Those performed abysmally. And, you know, when we think about, you know, rural voters will see through tokenization just as well as, you know, any other population would see through tokenization. You know, it is something that in the world of, you know, being bombarded by political ads, people will see right through. But one of the things that we're seeing here is that, you know, people who are neighbors are essential. One of the things that was really surprising to me is that, again, this is a poll of just rural voters. Local religious leaders were way far down on this list. way far down on this list compared to what I think, mainstream progressives might think of as, the hold of religion on rural communities.
What do you read into that, Kellen?
Oh, I don't know. I am not religious enough to have a real strong take, but I've been consistently just in awe, despite this, at how much sort of churches and faith communities are cornerstones of rural communities. But I think that the strength of that for the purposes of organizing is not using a religious leader as a mouthpiece, but is instead using the social network of a church, to seed broader bridge building efforts within the community. One of my favorite groups that has this down, is the Neighboring Movement out of Wichita, Kansas. And that's a guy named Adam Barlow Thompson and his team. And what they are about is not using, training one pastor to be this mouthpiece for a community, but instead, how do you organize a specific congregation to, restore the social fabric of a town? So I think that there's a distinction there that I am still learning because I'm not a person of faith. But for those looking about, how to do small town faith organizing right, give them a look. But I was happy to see teachers and educators, local doctors and nurses, all above local law enforcement. I think that the trustworthiness of members of the U.S. military and veterans and rural communities can't be overlooked. Although I think Democrats are sometimes wrong in their strategy to just we are going to, put a warmongering Democrat up against a, Republican in a contested seat and hope, hang their hats too heavily on, the trustworthiness or respect that rural communities have for veterans. Because I think that there's issues that are deeper than, just the nationalism in rural communities. So
Amy McGrath played the military card really hard.
Was trying to not name names, but
right.
I can do it now. That was an embarrassing showing.
Yeah, good. Antoinette.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for showing that graph because I worked in healthcare in hospitals for over 20 years in Cincinnati, but I am alarmed at the threat to rural hospitals and to therefore the healthcare of communities in small towns and in rural counties.
Yeah.
I know that there is quite a number of hospitals in those areas that are being bought up by big corporations. So they're becoming for-profit organizations. And that means they can be sold off after a few years and the resources sucked out of them, which happens not only in the healthcare industry, but in other industries too, with mergers and sales and things like that. Mm-hmm. But what alarms me is to see that statistic that local doctors and nurses are the top trusted people at 89%. And yet if these hospitals are in jeopardy of closing, etc., there goes a big local group of people to trust. So, yeah, what are some of the solutions? Are there solutions?
Well, it's the importance of seizing opportunities. For example, the ones provided by the stimulus that are, prioritizing, reinvigorating rural healthcare infrastructure. But when you think of farm consolidation, it's we're losing family farmers. Yeah. And then you look at local businessmen and women, local businesses are closing. And then teachers and educators, yeah, schools are consolidating. You know, you want to look at where, you know, Licking County, for example, spent its stimulus dollars. You know, they bought new police cruisers, right? So we're losing the messengers that are, you know, trusted, and also the ones that do form cornerstones of communities, right? But they're part of institutions that make up a healthy, you know, a healthy and self-reliant community. You know, but those battles are won, you know, in ways that, yes, do use, you know, these messengers as good, you know, good mouthpieces and as good messengers. But it involves a field strategy that really, you know, did not materialize this year, in terms of one that is very targeted and emphasizes rural communities. So
Yeah.
that's what
Who
I'll
would
say.
like to share or ask a question next? Yes, Ed, I know. I like it. You have a good question. Whenever we run out of questions, I'm going to turn to you, Ed. So keep it rolling.
Well, I'm going to take this down new territory. We brought up the new majority and this hope that we can find a lot of progressives to join the voters in the urban areas that are mostly people of color. You know, living in a rural county all my life practically, I don't see many progressives when it comes right down to it. I do see people who will support progressive issues, but those progressive issues, you know, in the real world, those progressive issues compete with a lot of conservative values. And Kellen, the discussion you and Ellen had was real enlightening, because that perception of corruption, that understanding of corruption, seems to be one of those conservative kind of values that you have to be careful about.
Yeah.
But another one, and it doesn't really show up that well in that last table that you showed about the trust, the level of trust that rural people have in the local religious leaders. That really surprised me that it was so low.
Yeah.
But rural communities have religious communities in rural areas have a very powerful influence over a lot of rural people. And I'm, for example, Catholic, and I'm actually a practicing Catholic in spite of everything.
Yeah. Yeah. I know a couple of Vincentians who I, you know, absolutely love. So I'm nothing against Catholics.
So this whole rural, pro-life movement is so deep. It is so deep.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder, how do you deal with it?
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, part of it is that they can be supportive of these progressive economic issues. However, there's also this other issue that is always there. And it's sometimes, too many times, it overrides everything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Call it the wedge issue for a reason.
Yeah. Well, so actually, I think that there is, I think that there's a few different questions in there, or at least a few different components to my answer. I think that separating the way that you separated sort of like issue agenda, values, and, you know, the dialectic of those two that may, ends up in a partisan vote somewhere, is good. But actually, I would add a third component. So maybe that's a trialectic. I don't know what the what the actual thing is. But I would call it civic infrastructure. So if we wanted to talk about rural values, which is something I could do, I came prepared. We use I'm not going to call it actually creepy, but it's definitely a little bit of a big brother tool that is called Grow Progress. And what it does is it listens passively to all of the social media content that is shared within a given community. Not social media, Facebook. And so when we look at, I can see Ohio. In fact, I've got it right open on my other tab. I can see and they break it down into a different set of values. And there's like 14 values or something like that. I'm just going to, this way I don't have to, talk. I'm just going to pull it up. So, So here we are. So this is Ohio. We're just looking at Ohio, and we're also just looking at very rural, and ex-urban communities. If I wanted to, I could also look at urban, very urban, and suburban, but we're talking about rural voters here, ruralorganizing.org. And so here is our big list of potential values with which they sort, all this content into. The top value, right, is merit. And this is based on, we're looking at a pool of, this is just the Cincinnati Senate districts. So I'm gonna change this. So we're looking, this is a sample of 3,446,000 social Facebook accounts, individuals on Facebook. Yeah. All of them are active voters. So we're looking at a huge sample here. And the top value here for rural Ohio voters, based on what social media content or Facebook content they're interested in, is patriotism. Mm-hmm. I don't think we're too surprised by that. And then authority, and then nostalgia, and then merit, and then security, and then purity, and then in-group care, right? And once we start to get below 50%, we're down here with emotionality, compassion, equality, environmentalism, independence, power, and hedonism and excitement are very low. But let's just stick here to what's important. So when we're thinking about messages, right, that we're crafting, and this is something that, we do, this isn't the only tool that we use, but it's certainly one that's interesting. The Democrats and progressives need to articulate what our version of patriotism is. And, we could sit here and criticize Barack Obama, I think, for a lot of reasons. But I think that Obama successfully and convincingly articulated an aspirational and, somewhat progressive version of patriotism that our side has been lacking. We cannot cede patriotism to the far right, because we were not going to cut, maybe eventually, as the new American majority shifts, this will change. But right now, the reality for 22 and 2024 is that we can't. Now, authoritarianism is very scary, and it is appealing. But this is the principle of being faithful to, a principle rooted in protecting the social order and following rules. Now, Ellen, who's thinking of how this relates to corruption, is probably over there thinking, wait a second, I can use this. This isn't that they value authoritarianism. It's that they value following the rules, right? And there's lots of Republican politicians. There's also Democrats who don't follow the rules. But when we're thinking about how do we create effective messages that lean into values, this is important. And I promise I'm going to circle back to abortion in a little bit, but just to get through this, nostalgia. I think that we can, this is important, but when I said that there's trauma that comes from being the one who closes the doors on the family business or the family farm, and progressives are coming in saying, no, we are going to emphasize locally owned businesses, and our goals here are to reopen the family business or reopen the family farm. This is what this stimulus is for, and Republicans voted against it. Then we start to think of, there are some new avenues that we can go down. Now, merit is important. I think that when we talk about, who rises to the top of the social ladders, in our messed up system, there are ways to craft effective messages here. But so if we want to zoom in to authority, right? This is accepting the social order and following the rules. So if I go over to the polling that we did as part of the election eve poll, which is again right before 2020, and I will show you this slide where they asked rural white voters about abortion. So abortion should remain a legal option in the United States. 50% of rural white voters, right? And again, these are rural voters where, 66% voted for Donald Trump, right? There's not 66% who totally oppose that. That message is above water in rural communities. As is, for example, we should take steps to reduce the prison population, right? A cornerstone of a racial justice agenda. The rise of violent white supremacists, again, totally agree, is a major threat. 59%, right? Imagine if Joe Biden was doing 59% in rural America with rural white voters. Police need to be held accountable for their actions when they kill or abuse people. We should get rid of laws that make it hard to prosecute police officers so they face justice just like everyone else. Totally support. There's your 67%, right? So, rural voters are actually with us on issues, right? On our issue agenda. And we see that if we actually think very deliberately, we can even come up with messages that pair to values. In fact, the message that we use that is informed by authority, that value of following the rules with abortion, is that, the message that also is above water in rural communities is that the choice of abortion should be between a woman and her family, plain and simple. That works. And also so does, abortion should not be illegal, right? So each of these are above water in rural communities, and with rural white voters. Where I actually think is where this starts to get scary, and I think where it points to the most work that we have to do, is these questions. Oh, I've passed it. Over the past few months, did anyone from a campaign, political party, or community organization contact to ask you to vote or register you to vote? 50% said yes and 50% no. Among rural white voters, this was the lowest contact demographic, right? It was, I believe that the sample was Black voters, Latino voters, white voters, Native American voters, and Asian and Pacific Islander voters. Asian American and Pacific Islander voters. Rural white voters had the lowest contact, and of those same demographics, the rural components of them all had the lowest contact rates. So did this. Did you take part in any of the following activities related to the 2020 election? Volunteer to help a candidate, party, or other organization. 8% of rural white voters said yes. And again, the rural components of all those other demographics similarly were far lower than the urban components. So this points to what we call, here's another one. Who was it that asked you to vote or register you to vote? Was it people representing Democratic candidates or the Democratic Party? 36% said yes. So that means 14% Democrats were asking, were engaging rural white voters more than the Republicans were, right?
Mm-hmm.
People would expect, oh, rural white voters, the Republican Party's out there organizing rural communities. It's not the case. It's not the case. But instead, what these numbers point to is a total erosion of what we call civic infrastructure, right? So it's, their rural voters are with us on key rural issues, and there's, even above water in abortion. And certainly, we need to lean into a bold racial justice agenda because, we cannot continue to have rural voters be our excuse to shrink away from, things like pathways to citizenship and decarceration, reducing police funding. No. In fact, when we did this poll, Black Lives Matter protesters were more popular than Donald Trump. Were more popular than the Republican Party with rural voters.
Wow.
They were also more popular than the Democratic Party, and they were more popular than Joe Biden. So when we think about things, the data really sort of spins some stuff on the head, and it shows us how important building rural civic infrastructure is. Because I think that that's actually how we're going to reverse performance. So when we're thinking about how to win back Ohio, it's not we're going to win back Ohio by telling our candidates to not talk about racial justice, or we're going to tell our candidates to not talk about women's rights, right? Or a woman's, freedom to choose. Instead, we need to build organizing strategies that compete intensely for rural votes. So
good going. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
What about the way to reach? If they're only 8% were really asked, if I remember that correctly, Kellen.
8% volunteered. 8% volunteered.
Volunteered. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's right. So what is the most effective way to engage with rural voters? But I guess some of that answer before is who do they trust is probably the best way. But what is the way? I mean, some people still make phone calls. They think that's popular, but we had somebody who's a great analyzer of reaching people nowadays, and they say it's dead. How many people answer their phone or still have a landline and all that? What is the way to reach voters?
Yeah, so I think that the best field strategy, our hands will be tied without inspiring. Right. Like I want to say that.
Say that again.
I said we could have the best field strategy we wanted in the state, but without inspiring candidates, we will be hamstrung.
Yeah.
So precursor there. But also we see that, and I could show you the numbers on which media is most trusted. It's all local TV. First is the local paper is the most trusted. Second is local TV, and third is local radio. Right. Those are the most trusted sources of information. Even though Facebook is the most used, people trust local media.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about how do we communicate, right? It's those issues. We already saw the best messengers, right?
Yeah.
And so now the best organizing with such, all fingers pointing to the local level, right? That's where, things have to be built deeper than just a single electoral campaign. I forget who it was who asked what we're up to in 2021. We already completed one campaign where we did exit interviews with 70 rural organizers from campaigns in 2020. And we basically asked, what'd you learn? What went well? What didn't? What are you going to do next time? And then also, what are your big takeaways for people who want to do rural work? And they said that we are asking way too much, expecting way too much of electoral organizing on year. We're expecting too much of local candidates. We're expecting too much of field organizers who are dealt rural turf. it's not enough time to rebuild the sorts of things that that are needed. Because there's some, just basic fabric that's really dissolved. And so, while there isn't a silver bullet, the recommendations that came from the people who did this all last year for people like y'all are the following. And it really emphasizes really intentional off-year organizing. The first was, we need to map our local communities in the off years, right? Second is we need to canvas, but we need to do it in a way that is inquisitive, right? We need to not bring an agenda to the door, but we need to collect our agenda from the people who answer them, right?
Yeah.
That's essential. Also, deep canvassing, persuasion canvassing is important, but it's a step and it's not the first step, right? It is a step that takes place after mapping, after researching, right? And then figuring out what is the thing that we want to move on and all of the thought that goes into a message and a script. The sort of messengers, messages, mediums that we've been talking about. The second is really strategic recruitment. I forget who it was. Like there's a feeling in rural communities that's like, man, I'm the only progressive out here.
Yeah, Ed.
And in some ways, that isolation is got to be the first thing that we put in our crosshairs, right? And I think that that's why ruralorganizing.org started, cranking out resources and being active on Facebook. We all have an Ohio Rural Organizers Facebook group, which y'all should all ask to join.
Yeah.
But it's we need to fight that isolation, and we need to think creatively about what connections we can make. That's why I'll never turn down one of these, like dropping in on a meeting like this. And thank you all for having me again.
Oh yeah.
The second, bombard local media, don't give up on it. And then when we asked people who are talking rural voters, how do you cut through the knee-jerk reactions that we think we can't overcome to organize, right? It's like, oh, I don't vote for Democrats or whatever. People actually, skilled organizers iterated, and they found out that this year, using humor, hyper-local framing of national issues, and then really accurate local information, right? Which, for example, it's not just talking about infrastructure. We're going to have an infrastructure investment. It's like, no, we're going to fix the 6th Street Bridge, right?
Yeah.
We're going to fill up the potholes on East Main, right? We're going to bring the hospital back, or the maternity ward back to the Memorial Hospital. It's that type of canvassing, that type of organizing that brings people in. And then the last thing, is we need to engage with the local, state, and federal legislation. And we can't shy away from projects that are mutual aid, right? Whether that's doing harm reduction work. There was so much like really cool food and census like combinations. I know Indivisible Appalachian Ohio does free haircuts, right? While doing voter registration right before school, like it's that type of creativity that we need to pursue. So.
Great. Yeah. John is next. John.
Yeah. I'm a nerdy guy. So I love graphs.
Me too.
The graphs were very interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, about that it shows this or that. To me, what it shows is people really aren't different. There may be differences high or low, but really fundamentally, they're similar, rural and urban. And I think, I would guess most of the people on this call are urban. And I think the biggest thing I know, continually do, is there are such stereotypes, blaming the rural, stereotyping the rural, they're this, they're that. And it's just, it's endless. And I think it's something that we can take on.
Yeah.
And participate in.
Yeah. I think that's a huge role for urban, urban progressives, right? It's just like, there's conventional wisdom that the data shows is wrong. It's bad conventional wisdom. And, there's a cultural change that needs, the progressive movement has reckoning upon reckoning to have And, I think that we began one with, racial justice within our movement this summer. But, as we're continuing to vie for, holding on to control of the legislature like we have right now at the national level, not state level, the time is ripe for a reckoning as well with, our conventional wisdom about rural communities. So yeah, you're here to that.
Well, Kellen, one of the things from our phone conversation I was really struck by is that as a young guy, we work with a lot of young organizers and campaign directors and all, but that you had a long stretch of working without much break.
Yeah.
And then about 5 or 6 weeks ago, I know you made the decision much earlier, but you made a significant taking care of yourself, really getting away, creating perspective. Would you describe why you did this? Because we got to take care of ourselves doing all this work. How you'd made that decision, and then what did you decide to do, and how did it go?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I think that, like, to invoke Martin Luther King, as organizers do and as organizers should, one of my favorite Dr. King quotes is, I think that some probably white reporter was asking him, like, how often do you pray? And he said, for an hour a day, I think. And then the reporter was like, yeah, but what about the days when you're really busy, right? And when you have so much going on. And then he's like, well, on the days when I'm really busy, I pray for 2 hours a day. And, I think of all, just another thing to aspire to, like that anecdote was in my head all year. And then I'm also at that interesting moment in life where, like, you have a little bit of agency, like I just went to college where my family could afford, like so many students. But then, I'm like, have a job, I'm working remotely, and I could really be working anywhere, but I didn't really know where there was to be. I'd seen my little corner of the Southeast and the Midwest. And so I packed my truck up and spent 6 weeks on the road, seeing where there was to see. So, it was so refreshing. I, have endless gratitude for my girlfriend and boss for each not replacing me in my respective roles while I was gone. But yeah, like it was life-giving. And I think, in a way, helped me remind myself that this country is still beautiful, worth fighting for, and it still is positively inspiring and not just like negatively inspiring to action. So that was important to connect to. So
how far did you go, and share a highlight or two?
10,000 miles, 10,000 miles on the road. Yeah.
On the road.
Yeah. 10,000 miles. And then, a highlight really was I had never seen the Tetons before, and I just can't recommend them enough. I pride myself in someone who's seen a lot of mountains for someone my age, but those were unlike any I'd seen. So
wow. Yeah. How about coming back? Last question about this, and then we have a few minutes left for completion. But what about coming back? How'd you do with the transition?
Yeah, it's the mission was a success in that I feel energized, not tired after for that long. So I'm bringing that energy back. And there's not a lot of community on the road, and that's one of the things that keeps me up, keeps me going. And so it's been good to plug back into that energy source.
Terrific. Oh, good. Thanks for sharing that. I wanted to hear more about that, and the smartness of your being able to do that, and the smartness of your partner and your boss that they understood.
Right.
Good going. Who has another question about the rural organizing or reaching rural voters? Who's next?
Marta has a question that she posted in the chat about what role do you see for the Ohio Democratic Party and its new chair, Liz Walters?
Yeah, so I think that the Ohio Democratic Party would be smart to revisit its map of priorities. And, you know, I think that the outgoing Democratic chair, you know, last statement was something like, we need, you know, we need to, you know, emphasize metros and we need to reconnect with small towns. And it's kind of like, yeah, no duh, you know, like what were you trying to do something else? Like, yeah. And so I think that, you know, rural progressives who feel very disconnected from, say, the Ohio Democratic Party, actually have a lot to not learn from the Ohio Democratic Party, but a lot to teach it. And so I think that, you know, the importance of doing research and doing interviews. I mean, I wish that the practice of exit interviews was standardized, you know, movement wide. It's not, unfortunately. But I think that, you know, an institution like the Ohio Democratic Party has the resources to get something like that really right. And it certainly has the individuals, it has the team. You know, I'm not harboring, you know, any criticism at all for the individuals who make it up. But the conventional wisdom that at least carried the Ohio Democratic Party through 2020 needs to be challenged. And I think it's best challenged by the people who are on the ground, you know, who have been, you know, sort of screaming into the void. So it feels like for many, for years now. So I think that she would be smart to do, you know, that sort of research. And I'm hopeful. I'm not someone at all who is ready to give up on Ohio as a state, that we can win, or give up on the Ohio Democratic Party as, you know, a vehicle to that victory. So
great.
That's what I'll say.
Yes. We have time for one more. Who would like to ask a question or comment? Yes, Antoinette.
I'm a city mouse, and is there a role for those of us who live in cities to support rural communities?
Yeah, you know, I think, well, in one way, some of the best rural organizers who I've had the pleasure of meeting while doing this work are people who are what we would call homecomers, right? People who grew up small town, went to a city for work or for school, and then who came back. And I just think people who have had those, you know, who have had a diversity of life experiences often, you know, turn those experiences into assets, and into creative problem solving. So, you know, I think that, you know, just because you're a city person now, but maybe, you know, may have been from a rural community at an earlier point in life, doesn't mean that you can't go back or reconnect in meaningful ways. Now, you know, for someone who's going to be in a city, you know, I think that there is work to do to build relationships with rural progressive organizations, and certainly Skillshare among grassroots groups. I think that that's important. There is not a lot of progressive leadership development that goes on in rural communities, especially remote rural communities. And sharing leadership development experiences with seedling, you know, rural grassroots groups, I think is crucial. I think it's great. And, you know, that goes with inclusion in, you know, all the things that there are to be included in, you know, that a group that's a strong community like this does. You know, like I said, I know that y'all are based in the Cincinnati area, and you know, candidates like Michelle Novak this past year in 2020 could have really used, spare energy and spare support from her neighbors in other communities. And so I think it's just, looking for ways to plug in and to offer, skill sharing, resource sharing, and solidarity, with rural groups. Because that project of connecting rural communities to the progressive movement and the progressive movement to rural communities is going to be decades long. And starting at the bottom, I think, is the best place to start. So,
Good. Kellen, you are, one last one. Ed.
Yeah, of course.
Not necessarily a question, just a comment, Kellen.
Yeah.
I think what you said there in terms of your answer for, I think, Antoinette, is spot on in terms of a recent development in Northwest Ohio. I had mentioned, let's say 15 counties, mostly rural. There's a women's caucus that was formed, a regional women's caucus.
Yeah.
And that cuts across the urban and the rural counties. And it's got really pretty good leadership in it. And the point of that is that's an organization that came into existence where there can occur that resource sharing, that skills sharing. And in some of these rural areas, there's a need. There's a need for leadership and some skills. And with that kind of sharing, that's how it can be done.
Yeah. That's a hopeful place, and it gives us a map of moving forward. Kellen, thank you so much for sharing here and for doing what you're doing. I mean, it's just, it's so important. Let's stay in touch. We know we should, let's see, I want to support you. So I'm going to get this right, ruralorganizing.org. And we do what? Do we become a member? Do we join on social media? What do we do to support you?
Good question. Good question. So one of the first things I would recommend, an easy way to plug into our stream of resources for grassroots organizers like y'all, is to go to ruralorganizing.org, click on the resource page, and you'll see a lot of basically further reading documents about the stuff that I've talked about.
Good.
Additionally, there's a place, we have a guy whose name is CJ Peterson, who ran a really great campaign in rural Iowa, who puts together he's a small town candidate. He puts together rural press clips for us every day. And so if you want specifically rural progressive news, to understand what's going on in rural in rural communities, progressive lens, plug into that. That's a great place to be. And then if y'all will go to the Rural Ohio Facebook group and ask to be members, we'll add you. And it's great networking, and it will enable people to make those sort of cross geographical connections. And then the last thing is, if you are, Richard and I had a great conversation where he was very helpful with my landscape report that I'm working on right now. But if you're part of a grassroots group locally and want to tell me about what's going on in your area and what your organization's priorities are, what your needs are to take your work to the next level, please shoot me an email. I'll just put my email in the chat. And I never say no. Oh, it's not Kellen at gmail.com. It's Kellen at ruralorganizing.org. That's the right one. And I'd love to connect. So there's no membership. We don't have ruralorganizing.org members and no chapters. But yeah.
And you don't send things out like a sign up for the once a week newsletter coming from the organization. We go to you. You don't come to us. Is that accurate?
That's right. That's right. Unless we end up doing a campaign in the area. And then that's probably the best way to plug in. But really, we we were set up to do like a regional Ohio Appalachian convening back a year ago. And it's something that we really love, doing some, sort of like local in-person crash courses. But unfortunately, just with COVID, we've put that effort on hold. We hope to get back to it because those sort of networking opportunities is something we want to be, helping to make happen. So stay tuned on Ohio in-person, get to know you type stuff.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Kellen, so much. It's been fantastic. Thank you for each of you coming. This will be a recording that'll be available on the Bold New Democracy YouTube channel and on the website. If you're not involved in YouTube and Bold New Democracy, we meet each Tuesday night for over 3 years now at 7 o'clock. Please join in. It's easy to pop in and be with us. And then on Thursday nights like this, we call these deep dives. So we just did a deep dive with you, Kellen. I hope it was enjoyable for you or fun too, because our work's got to be fun too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks,
great.
Kellen.
Thank you
Thank you, everyone, for coming and for taking part. And let's keep it going. Let's one step forward, then another. Keep it flowing. Good night, everyone.